Thought I'd share with you the wheel hubs and the spokes that I have prepared and ready to go when I get the re-chrome wheels back. These hubs, I completed the rebuild of them some weeks ago actually now, and they've been just sitting off the side covered up. But they've been repainted, and new bearings, new seals. The lining was cleaned up, and as I think I talked about before, I did check the specifications, and these on both hubs are within spec. Again, here's the rear hub, new seal, new bearings, both sides. And then of course the backer plates for the brake shoes themselves. See, that's the speedometer drive in there. Everything's been remounted. These are new shoes here. And the cams were replated earlier, quite a bit earlier. The spokes, I think I also referenced that I was considering having the original spokes replated, which I have had done in the past. But what I encountered is that the cost to have the new spokes replated would exceed the cost of being able to buy new ones. So these spokes right here are aftermarket spokes. These came from, I think, Indonesia. They're brand new. And the combined set, front wheel, rear wheel, actually it's quite a bit less money with nipples than investing in having the originals redone. I could have replated the originals myself, I suppose. That's a lot of work with this many spokes. That's 72 spokes and nipples that would have to be cleaned and replated and then polished. You're talking about a lot of time and a lot of kind of drudgery, to be honest with you. And for the cost that these spokes came in at, which I don't recall off the top anymore, I think delivered, I want to say delivered, these were around $80 US to my door. You just couldn't beat it. So new spokes, wheel hubs ready to go, and we're just waiting for those new freshly chromed, re-chromed rather, wheels to show up so I can put the wheels back together and get the bike up on it. Let's talk about the horn a little bit. I did reference this earlier in the video series on restoring the wiring lower harness, and I did test this horn. It does work. The issue I have with the horn is its general physical condition. You can see it's starting to corrode on both sides, as well as there's some denting right here. And there's really no practical way to get this apart, to replate it or try to restore it, even though it works. The wiring, this piece of the harness here, that being the silver gray covering, I could replace that, of course, but I don't think it's worth it. The bracket itself, I also talked about this very briefly previous. This is the original bracket that I just replated and polished, as well as the screws that came out of the bracket. The grommets that were used as part of these screws to hold this onto the frame are not serviceable. Those are dry rotted, and I threw those away. So I had to come up with a solution for the horn, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Three, two, one. A little research, I discovered that Honda does still support actually the same horn. Now this is the new replacement horn. Came in under that part number. It's an identical horn. In fact, it's even made by the same manufacturer, Mitsura. I don't know if you can see that or not, right there. It's an identical horn in virtually all respects. There is some minor variation in the wiring itself, and of course the bracket is different, but the horn itself is absolutely identical. It's a 6-volt horn, and still supported by Honda. This is around $28 US new, as you see here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bracket off. You can see it even came with grommets right there. I'm going to take this bracket off, mount this bracket on, the one that came with the SL125, and I'm going to do a little changing to the wiring. Now the wiring will work just as it comes here. Even the pigtail is the right orientation. The color is different. You will see that this has a black for the earth or ground right here. This has, well, I guess that's red, because this is, I think, supposed to be green right here, and that's green. And the pigtail matches up. That's a female style pigtail. So the male here is black, here it's red. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take this black sleeving off and I'm going to replace it with silver. I've got approximately the right size sleeving to replace that. As I've said before, I keep sleeving in stock. I usually keep 4 to 6 feet, a couple of meters worth in stock of different sizes. I'm going to leave the ends on, of course. I'm going to take this sleeving off, replace it with the silver, and I think what I'm going to try to do with this red wire is I'm just going to put some black heat shrink tubing over this section right here and have it hidden by the silver, the new silver gray loom cover sleeve. And then I'll do the same thing on this end so that the red will then look black. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do here. In a moment, I'm going to do that off camera because there's really nothing complicated about it, and we'll come back in a few minutes when I've got that done. It's about 15 minutes or so later, and I have the transition completed. As you can see, I added about a 2-inch section of heat shrink tubing black on this end and on this end of the red wire to emulate the original black wire that was in here on the original horn. And I replaced the sleeving with the silver gray new material. The way I did that is I heated these ends up, these plastic boots, these vinyl boots, with gently with a hot air gun and slid them off. Then I slid off the original black plastic sleeving. I didn't have to cut it off. Added the heat shrink tubing on each end, shrunk it in place, and then put the silver gray sleeving back on, and then reverse the process of heating these vinyl boots gently with a hot air gun and slip them back in place. Now, if that was to give me trouble, and it didn't, but if it would have, what I would have done is just clip these ends off and put new ones on out of my wiring kit. But it worked out okay. A couple other things. I think I might have originally mispronounced the brand name. That's a Mitsuba. I don't know if you can see that there, M-I-T-S-U-B-A, Mitsuba. And this is not the original part number for this horn right here. This part number, I think, is a replacement for other small single-cylinder Hondas, but that's not the right one, the right number for this horn, though the horn is identical itself, probably because of the bracket, which, as you can see, I changed out. This is the original bracket that came with the bike. Holes all lined up perfectly, probably because of the bracket, and the coloring of the wiring is different, that being red versus black. I'm guessing that's why part number is different. In terms of replacing the bracket, I did reuse the grommets that came with the new horn and bracket. So the grommets here are new, and the screws themselves, I used the new ones. The washers right here underneath the screws, I used the old ones because they're quite a bit thinner. Here's the original, or the new washer, by the way, that came with the horn, versus the old one, which is probably half that thick. And I wanted to make sure I had full purchase going into this horn body, so I used the old washers. Otherwise, all the parts are new except the bracket. I think that's going to be it for the horn. The next time you see this, it should be mounted on. We're going to talk now about the controls and switches. These are the controls that fit on the handlebars on the right side here, on the left side here. This is a complicated one, the one on the right. This is has the headlamp switch on and off, as well as low and high, as well as this kill button. And then the other control only has the horn button. So this one was far more involved to restore it. I took the switches all apart and cleaned them, replated some of the parts, and then of course re-sleeved them, checked the continuity of the wiring to make sure everything was intact. Had to do a few repairs here and there. So let's talk about the simpler one first, the one on the left. This is nothing but a horn button, and it mounts, this mounts on the bottom, and then this would mount on the top like that. I think you can see it there. And these are all original components. I just pulled it apart, cleaned it, polished it, as you can see. And I did test the horn, and it does, or the wiring rather, and the button, and it does work. One minor repair here, this wiring right here was not broken, but the insulation had been damaged. It looked like it had been pinched somewhere along the way, so I just slipped this piece of heat shrink over it and shrunk it down to protect the integrity of the insulation. And then of course I did re-sleeve it with a new silver gray sleeving like you can see there. And this does fish, both of these fish through the handlebar. This will be hidden out of sight anyway, so that black heat shrink tubing won't be a problem. So that one was very straightforward. This one is a little bit more involved because there's a lot more going on. Again, I had this all apart and cleaned it and replated it. This plate was replated, this arm was replated, the screws were cleaned. I didn't replate the screws. As you might notice, I did not re-sleeve this end, these ends here of the sleeving. I didn't think I needed to. They're not damaged, they're a little discolored, they're a little bit stiff. But I just left that alone. But the rest of the sleeving, of course, was replaced, and that was an absolute bear. These wire, this was approximately the same diameter wire that Honda originally used, and these barely fit through there, all of them. There's what, 8 or 9 of them in here, I think. And what I ended up doing with the very last wire is I put a piece of, take a piece of extra wire that I have. It's a little bit smaller in gauge than this, and I strip it back and I wrap that around and fish that through before I pull all the wires through. And then what I use is the opposite end of that wire to pull this through the sleeving. And then I ended up using a little heat, a little gentle heat from the heat gun, and work this along. I used my vise. You've seen me do that before in previous videos. And had to gradually work that through, and I did get it to work. Generous application of dielectric grease also to help make things good and slippery, but we did manage to get that done. The other complicated part of this switch was this kill button. Of course, these are no longer available, at least that I'm aware of. If anyone out there is aware of a source of original kill switches, that is this red switch here on the top, let me know. I was not able to find one. What I ended up doing is purchasing a used control for a Honda CB750 that had this switch on it. It's not the identical switch that was used on the SL125. It's very close though, and it did work. I ended up, because the tab under here, and I don't know if you can see that where my thumb's pointing to, that's just a stop here on the bottom that protrudes like this. And the orientation of that tab was 90 degrees from the original. The original had a relief cut in the control right here for that tab to fit into. So what I had to do, since this was rotated, I had to put this control in my mill and mill a new, and I know it's pretty hard to see here, I had to mill a new slot from here to here so that protrusion would fit down over like that. And you'll never see that when it's in use, of course. The rest of the switch worked fine. It was an exact match in the way it fit through, and there's a C-clip in here that holds this all together. And again, these controls have been tested. Each of the wires in each of the positions has been tested to make sure that they work. So I'm satisfied that these controls will be ready to go back on the handlebars when I get to the point of installation. So I do a little walkabout of the frame to show you what I've been up to in terms of beginning the reassembly. to the frame of the various components. And you might hear the computer fan in the background running. I am doing some video work on the shop computer, and that hum really unfortunately can't be avoided, so you just have to bear with me on that. Some of this, of course, you've seen before, and that being the installation of the engine, the swing arm, and the rear shocks. The first thing you'll probably notice, I do have the frame up on this jack stand here, obviously to get it up off the ground in preparation for eventually reinstalling the freshly chromed and mounted wheels and tires. You also notice I've got a couple of straps here. That's just to hold the frame down in the event I was to bump it as I move around. I don't want obviously falling off that jack. We're going to start at the steering head here at the front, and then we're going to work our way back. So allow me to reposition the camera a bit, and we'll continue on here. In this shot, you can see I have the top part of the steering head triple tree right here mounted. That is that new nut and washer that I got from Honda. I talked about that earlier. This is not tightened down. In fact, this whole assembly is loose right now. These screws can't come out. There's a threaded washer that fits in the middle here that prevents those from coming out. So that's just really placed on there and set on there, just keep it out of the way, and it's nice and secure. I had originally talked about remounting the fork tubes, the front forks. I decided not to do that, as I didn't want to have to manhandle them too many times. Otherwise, if I put them into the steering stem, I would have to remove them to put the headlight ears on. I didn't want to manipulate those parts around the chrome any more than I absolutely had to, so I just left them off. You notice here the steering lock has been installed. That is not the original lock. This bike did come with a lock and 2 keys. However, I could not get that lock to work. And these are all over on eBay, very easy to get. That's a very pristine lock, so I just ordered that one from eBay. Cleaned it up a little bit, re-lubricated it with graphite, and remounted it with the original screws that I re-zinc plated here. I do have 2 new keys coming for it that will match the style of the keys. It's mounted in the ignition lock right here, and we'll get to that in a minute. But they won't be the same key. They're not keyed alike, but they will be 2 new keys, and I'm expecting them here in the next few days or a week. You'll note I have the ignition lock mounted here with the 2 new keys. You also note I've got just a piece of blue masking tape wrapped around the spare key just to keep it from banging against the frame, and a little protection for the key and the frame both. You'll also note that the wire loom that I restored a number of videos back now is loosely mounted. I really haven't put any effort into routing the wiring at this point. I've really just kind of laid it in there to get an idea how it might fit. I think it's pretty close to how it's going to be routed before it's over, but it's really just laid up in there. I did install a new aftermarket coil and condenser. The wire, the high tension lead for the coil that goes down to the spark plug, I did have to shorten, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail when we get to the other side of the bike. Again, those are aftermarket. Honda does not support either one of those parts anymore, and you can find used items on eBay and all over, but I just didn't want to take the chance of something not working on a 50-year-old or so coil and condenser. So those are aftermarket. The only issue with the coil is the connectors, the male-female connectors on the end of the wiring were reversed, the male and female. That would match up with the wiring from the bike, the original wiring from the bike. So what I did is just replace those with my own ends to match the motorcycle wiring loom. Other than that, it went together fine. The points right here, this bike did not have a set of points when I got it. Didn't have a coil or condenser either, for that matter. Those are very pristine used points. They look brand new. Again, they're not available from Honda anymore. You can buy them aftermarket. That's a set of original Honda points. They came off mid-70s Honda SL125 or something similar. It's the same set of points. They're virtually perfect. I don't think this bike had very many hours on it that those points came from, and they were just as clean as could be. So I just touched them up and then mounted them. And of course they came with the wire lead also that ties up into the condenser. I did do an initial adjustment of the timing, the ignition timing, so it should be in the ballpark. I will probably check that again before I go to start the bike, but I'm thinking pretty close right now in terms of timing. Here you can see I have the stator assembly mounted. That is installed with new screws. And you can see the wire that goes down to the neutral switch is already mounted. Again, I haven't really done much to tuck the wiring away outside of just kind of put it up in there. But that is virtually ready to go outside of finish the routing and then plugging into the wire harness up in here. The sprocket I have not ordered yet. You can still get those from Honda. They're kind of pricey, but I've got to track down the sprocket yet to mount that obviously eventually. In terms of this part of the bike, there's really not much new outside of the wiring harness I just alluded to a moment ago. I just draped it in there for now. I just got a couple of zip ties. I got one here and one over here just to hold it in place. Those are not permanent. Those will be clipped out eventually and replaced with the original Honda style wrap, which actually I already have, but I'm not going to install that until I get to finessing the wiring placement. But it's just, the wiring is just placed in there now, just hold it in place. You can also see I've added the crankcase vent tube right here. That is the original that came with the bike. And then the cap down here is for the cam chain adjuster, and that is a new cap, which you can still, believe it or not, get from Honda. Down here you'll see the chain guard, or chain guide, I think is a better term, right there. That guide, this bike did not have one when I got the bike. That is an aftermarket reproduction. That is made in the U.S., believe it or not. And I think some guy just put together a little cottage industry of making those. And there might be a few other items for small bikes that he reproduces as well. But you can find these occasionally on eBay. They're kind of expensive. They almost always are damaged, have chain damage to them. If I was to buy a used one off of eBay, I would certainly probably have to repair it, weld it up, and grind it back. And this was not expensive. I want to say it's around $20 US dollars. It came zinc plated but unpainted. So I just ordered it, cleaned it, painted it in the same paint that I used for the rest of the bike, let it dry for a week or so, and then mounted it, as you can see here, using a new Honda bolt and washer. That's the right bolt for that location according to the Honda parts diagram. Let's go around to the other side. There's not near as much going on this side of the bike. You will see here I have mounted the new horn. That's permanently mounted. And again, I didn't plug everything into the wiring loom yet, as you might have noticed on the other side. So I did fish the wires up through, and I'll tie up all the wiring at one time at a later date. But that is permanently mounted now, and you can see the high tension lead for the coil coming down to the spark plug. That was quite a bit too long. In fact, it was probably 33% longer, a third longer than what that is right now. So I just clipped it off, pulled the cap off, which came with the lead, by the way, or with the coil, by the way, and just rethreaded it back on. It's just a threaded fitting there that threads into the end with a screw that protrudes from the spark plug cap that threads into the wiring on the end of that high tension lead. So I just clipped it off the size and put it in place. You'll notice the piece of clean paper towel here that I put in the intake, so the carburetor mounts, just to keep dust and debris out of the intake part of the engine. And the lower end I haven't really done anything with since I mounted the engine in the frame. I usually keep just an old towel over the top of this to keep, again, dust and debris out from where I work in my shop, and powder coating and grinding and welding, and you know, there's almost always debris in the air. So I usually just keep a clean towel over the top of that, a cloth towel, not paper towel, that just to keep that clean. And the rest of this back here, I think you've already seen. You can see there, I think, let me zoom in a little bit for you. You can see the lock, the ignition lock, a little bit better right there. Again, I know I talked about this a bit on the other side, but that lock, it does work, works fine. And all I did was clean it, and I did touch up the paint, you know, the red, there was, I believe there was 2 red spots, dots, to indicate, you know, the positioning of the key. And I did touch those up with red paint. I don't know if it shows up there very well. And again, that key came with the lock. It's the correct key for the lock. It's an aftermarket key. It probably was made by a locksmith or in a hardware store. So though the key works, it's not a Honda key. And that's why I have 2 new ones coming that will match the style of the ignition key on the opposite side. So that's going to be it for this walkabout. In fact, this is going to be it for this second in the 2-part series of the repair and restoration of some of the components that are going back on the SL125 project. I will undoubtedly pick this series up at a later date as I begin more reassembly. That will probably be after I get the chrome back, reassemble the wheels and the spokes, get the tires mounted, and start to put those items back on the bike. We'll undoubtedly talk more and more going forward eventually, but it won't be right away in the near term. That's going to be it for this video. Any issues, thoughts, questions, feel free to drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.